So there's a lot of different theories about how narcissistic personality disorder develops. So I'm going to touch on two different ways of thinking about this. The first one, I'm going to talk about relational trauma and how that contributes to the development. And then I'm also going to talk about a little bit about the neurobiology and what's going on neurologically for people that have this disorder. So I'll first start with relational trauma. So the overarching idea is that relational trauma, this type of relational trauma and how NPD develops is it comes from caregivers who are emotionally unavailable or unresponsive, inconsistent, or inappropriate. So I'm going to talk more in detail about that. Um, a lot of the theory that's out there talks about how NPD is basically comes out of this place of shame. And what the other side of that coin, right, is that it can also come from this sense of false empowerment. So there is a psychologist, his name is Terrence Real. He is the founder of relational life therapy. He's very good. So he talks, I'm going to piggyback off of some of the things that he's come up with. He talks about this grid. So it's kind of like if you imagine a cross, right? There's a horizontal axis, right, and a vertical axis, and they intersect to kind of make a cross. So the horizontal axis is this continuum of boundaries that go from rigid all the way to non-existent, right? And then the vertical kind of intersecting um, uh, continuum is going to go from really high self-esteem or that sense of false empowerment to really low self-esteem or disempowerment and shame, right? So then that's essentially going to result in these four quadrants, right? So if we think about each quadrant, so if the first kind of upper left quadrant, so that we're going to have the rigid boundary with the high esteem or sense of false empowerment. That type of parenting is going to look like really high expectations that are really unrealistic or kind of just inappropriate, right? So this is when we see this as an example, parents who try to live vicariously through their kids, for example. Maybe let's say there's a dad who played hockey, right? And he has a son and he's like, you will be the best hockey player, right? Don't care what you want. Don't care what your opinion is. This is your course, right? He might take them to practices, excessively or have these excessive demands on the child, right, to make him the best hockey player, for example, right? So really rigid boundaries, high expectations, and putting this child on this pedestal of I have to be the best, right? So that's sort of one way that false empowerment can sort of develop, if you will. So in the upper right quadrant, right? So now we're still in that false sense of empowerment or pedestal, but we're with no boundaries. So this is a parent who has really inappropriate boundaries. They overshare things with their kids that are not developmentally appropriate. They might treat their child as a peer, or there might even be a little bit of a role reversal. This is where some codependency develops, where the child ends up having to take care of the parent in some ways, right? And this can even be sexual abuse. So, right, if there's incest where a parent is sexually abusing a child, for example, that's a very inappropriate role. That's what you should be doing with a peer, not with a child, right? So it's still raising them up in this sense of false empowerment, like, you're so special that I get to share these experiences with you, right? Again, not that's why I call it false empowerment, right? But that's another way sometimes even where narcissism can develop. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they feel that way, right? They might still feel a lot of shame, but they might view themselves in this high place, if you will. So then we go to the bottom right quadrant, right? So we're still on the no boundaries, but we're on the low or disempowerment and shame. This is where there could be like physical abuse, manipulation, things like that. Then we swing over to the bottom left quadrant. So this is, again, we're back to the really rigid boundaries with that disempowerment. This is where we're going to get a lot of potentially like verbal abuse and emotional abuse, but also stonewalling. So this is the parent who's maybe just absent as well, right? Or neglectful. So these are all the ways that we can experience misattunement, or people can experience misattunement from their parents, right? In abusive ways that can create either that false empowerment or that shame, or a little bit of both. That can sort of be the root of where some of that narcissistic tendency comes from, and where the disorder can develop. The issue with these types of caregivers is that they typically aren't engaging in that healthy parental mirroring. Parental mirroring is a concept in developmental psychology that refers to the way parents or primary caregivers reflect back the emotions and behaviors of their children. So children who don't have that healthy parental mirroring then can have a difficult time forming a realistic sense of themselves, having healthy cognitive development, which can also result in them developing really fragile sort of self-esteem, right? Or that I would say even that falsely empowerment, that's pretty fragile too, right? They're pretty I would say people who feel like they've been put on that pedestal unwillingly are really afraid to fall off. What bad thing is going to happen to me if I step out of this role, or if I don't meet these expectations? So they sort of have to maintain that. So fragile self-esteem means having feelings of self-worth that are uncertain or unstable, and that can be easily challenged or influenced, right? And then the person will tend to be preoccupied with protecting and enhancing that self-esteem, often at the expense of others, right? It's really like a survival tactic or mechanism, right? Like I have to figure out, I either feel so much shame, right, that I put myself on this pedestal to protect myself, or I've been put on this pedestal unwillingly, but I'm too scared to fall off, right? So people with narcissism are like, how do I protect this and myself? And it's very much a survival mechanism or means where it's like all about them, right? I don't care who I hurt in my path. Like this is what I need to stay safe. So then we can jump into kind of what's happening neurologically, right? So people that have true narcissism, again, I'll just kind of summarize a little bit of what we talked about, either have that deep interpersonal or relational wound, and are trying to overcompensate, right, by denying that fragility or vulnerability, putting themselves on that pedestal, or have been falsely empowered, which makes them assume that pedestal and fear of falling off. So then they end up tending towards that grandiosity, entitlement, lack of empathy for anyone else but themselves, because that's what they need to feel and stay safe. Also, then they can't take accountability for their actions, because this would prove that they did something wrong. And if they did something wrong, then they would need to have remorse, guilt, shame. And those feelings are very, very unsafe for somebody with narcissism. It threatens that status, right? And it really then threatens their survival. So when our survival feels threatened, what do? We usually go into a fight, flight, freeze response, right? So when this is happening, when a person with narcissism is feeling threatened, they will assume one of these, but typically they first assume what would be considered a fight pattern. So lots of people talk about that narcissistic rage, right? That they see. This is their psyche engaging in a fight response. When they're in this rage, it can also often trigger automatically another defense mechanism in the psyche, which is dissociation, right? So I think this is a concept that is sort of maybe not known about or maybe misunderstood, but many people that with narcissism that go into these rages either don't remember it because they dissociated, right? And their psyche might have unconsciously repressed it. So they're often what I find when I work with people is that they talk about the explosiveness, right, of this person with narcissism. And then later that person, the person with NPD, they'll deny it, right? It might actually be that they don't remember. It's not an excuse, right? But it could actually be what's happening neurologically. Um, or they are actually denying intentionally, right? And this is kind of where we'll differentiate a little bit between more overt versus more covert types of narcissism, right? So an overt or malignant narcissism will be someone who is lying and denying, right, that they went into this rage. Whereas a more covert form of narcissism, which is harder to detect, are these people who went into that fight response, dissociated during it, don't really remember, and they do truly believe that they didn't do that or can't imagine themselves having done that, right? So that's why the covert narcissism is a lot trickier to recognize or deal with sometimes. I mean, they're both very difficult, but also when this fight, flight, freeze response is happening, it's happening what we would call in the limbic system of our brain. So the limbic system is in the middle of our brain, right? And that's where we have the amygdala, which is the fear response, and a lot of other important things. However, when that's happening, we actually lose contact or communication with the frontal lobe. We are operating primarily in survival mode. So our frontal lobe of our brain, right, kind of behind our forehead, that has impulse control, emotion regulation, our ability to think rationally, our ability to link consequences to our actions, right? All of that is gone when that limbic system is lit up and we're in that fight flight mode. So again, people that are in that, people with narcissism that are in that, right? You see them not thinking rationally. They're not controlling their impulses, right? It can be very scary. The other thing that's happening when we're in that state, that fight, flight, freeze, is our cortisol levels are spiked. When that happens, it actually decreases blood flow in the brain. When we don't have enough blood flow in the brain, we cannot sort of connect to other parts of the brain. That communication is really slowed down. So there's a lot of barriers to that person being able to access ration, reason, control, etc. during those times. The other important thing to think about too, so again, we talked about how relational trauma is, I would say, always present with somebody who has NPD, right? When that trauma happens, it's generally in those formative years of life, right? Those early childhood years of life with a caregiver, with a sibling, um, somebody close to them. And when that happens, that trauma is it's encapsulated neurologically in their brain. When that happens, it sort of removes that time or that experience off of the typical chronological trajectory of the brain, right? So what that means is when that neural network is lit up, when there is a threat to the person with narcissism, and it triggers this memory, right, of this past trauma. This isn't necessarily conscious, right? Their brain might regress to that very encapsulated time in space, meaning if that trauma happened when they were 5 years old, let's say, they are now regressed back into the state of an emotional state of a 5-year-old. So we often see, again, no connection to the frontal lobe, right? So we're not acting very rationally. They're not acting very rationally, I should say, when when they're going into these states, but they could also be acting almost like they're having an adult tantrum or something, right? Very immature. So what I tell people is, if you want to really respond appropriately or effectively when you're in these situations, you need to sort of consider the developmental age that the person is appearing in that moment in order to understand like really what their neurological capacity is. I think like another misattunement that happens very understandably, right, is what when we are in an interaction with somebody with NPD and we are just going, this doesn't make any sense. And like, what is happening? Right. It's like, oh, because we're not really dealing with like a logical, rational adult brain right now. Right. We're dealing with something much more immature. And referencing Terrence Real again, he talks about the adaptive child part of us and the wise adult part of us. So they are in their adaptive child part a lot of the time, people with NPD, right? And if we are relatively healthy, we're in our wise adult most of the time, right? And so it's a total misattunement, but it's another way to sort of help think about like or make sense of maybe that crazy making that people come up against when they're dealing with somebody with NPD.